tonight, and we're extremely grateful for that. Oh, it's not on? Sorry. What am I doing wrong here? I knew something was going to go wrong. Where do I do that? It's there. Oh, yeah. I apologize. British people are not good with their technology. I'm sorry about that. Or Cambridge people. It's wonderful to see so many of you out here tonight, and we're deeply grateful for that. And my name is Paul Griffiths, and I direct the Western European Studies program here at Iowa State. This is our first event, and so we're delighted to see so many of you here, and we'll be putting on a lot more stuff next year, so we'll be looking forward to seeing some of you back here, those of you with an interest in Western European study and culture and politics. Before I introduce Mateusz, who's going to introduce Andy Markowitz, our speaker for tonight, I'd like to thank the bodies who have been funding us and generously, the GSB, the Miller Fund, the History Faculty, Political Science, and also Foreign Languages and Literature. And now I'd like to hand you over to Mateusz Kalbara, Professor of Political Science here, who's going to introduce Andy.
Okay, thank you, and good evening. Thank you for turning out in such large numbers. It is a tremendous honor to introduce Andy Markowitz, who is the Karl Deutsch Collegiate Professor of Comparative Politics and German Studies at the University of Michigan. A little bit on his biography. He was born in Romania, and I have to point out his multilingual identity. Born in Romania, he obviously was taught Romanian in school, but his family spoke German and Hungarian, and he was tutored both in English and French. At some point, he ended up in the United States. He got his PhD, and you finished your Abitur in Vienna, and sort of traveled between the worlds, and I think you still see yourself as a world traveler in between different worlds. He received all his degrees from Columbia University in New York with his PhD in 1976. After his PhD, he went to the Center of European Studies at Harvard University, where he remained essentially an active member and research associate until 1999. While there, he founded, or in conjunction also with Harvard, he founded the journal German Politics and Society, which has become the foremost scholarly journal on modern German politics in the United States. Professor Markowitz has held faculty positions at Wesleyan University, at Boston University, at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and now at the University of Michigan. He has published 14 books, an edited volume, well over 100 scholarly articles and more than 50 review essays. He has been invited to more than 350 lectures at academic conferences, universities, and other scholarly settings. In addition to his own multilingual background, his publications have also appeared in many different languages: German, Italian, French, Spanish, Dutch, Swedish, Hungarian, Chinese, and Hebrew. Didn't you tell me there's a Bulgarian translation of your newest book out there too? Yes. He has also held visiting appointments at Osnabrück University, Bochum University, Innsbruck University, Tel Aviv University, and in 1998, 1999, he was a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. This past year, in 2002 to 2003, he was a visiting professor of social studies at Harvard University. His interests are largely in the areas of German and European labor, German and European social democracy, social movements, German-Jewish relations, Germany's role in the New Europe, and recently anti-Americanism in Europe, and in addition to that, the comparative sociology of modern sports culture. Of his 14 books, I'll just mention 4. He published The German Predicament, Memory and Power in the New Europe, which assesses Germany's position in the New Europe, The German Left, Red, Green, and Beyond, and The Politics of Scandal, Power and Process in liberal democracies, and one of his latest books was called Offside, which looks at the American exceptionalism in sports culture. Tonight, Professor Markowitz will talk to us about European anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism, ever present, though always denied. Please welcome Professor Markowitz.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction and the invitation. I'd like to thank the wonderful turnout. It's really great. I'm very, very appreciative. Thanks to Paul Griffith for organizing this, and above all, of course, to Matthias Kellberer, who is an old colleague and friend, and also happens to be one of the best political economists working on Europe. And I was also delighted to see Dick Mansbach, who turns out shares with me my great admiration and love for the one and only Karl Deutsch, whose name graces my chair at Michigan. And lastly, many thanks to David Buch to travel from far and wide to come to hear this lecture. What I'll do is basically proceed in sort of 4 parts. One, I'll give briefly an introduction, a definition about what I mean by anti-Americanism, and particularly European anti-Americanism. Then I'll do a very brief historical overview of this. I will then kind of digress and basically talk about anti-Semitism, although my own research on anti-Semitism is totally secondary. It's really more as an integral part also, or the twin of anti-Americanism. That's how I'm analyzing it. I then will talk about an empirical study in which I'm engaged in, which is part of this endeavor, which has just been accepted at Princeton University Press. And then lastly, sort of what this all means in terms of contemporary European politics. Now, this is kind of all module produced, which means that if I see that it's kind of long, one section is long, I can easily cut it, and then we'll see as to how we do in terms of time. Now, I think one need not be a particularly diligent student of survey research to know that antipathy towards America and Americans has become a worldwide phenomenon. Just recently, last week, the Pew study has come out again. I'm sure you saw a big article in the New York Times and elsewhere. This is a second study, the one that existed last year, which basically shows that the United States is probably actually, I would think historically, at least certainly since the history of survey research, one of the most disliked and disdained, actually, countries. Okay. Now, my study actually concentrates solely on Europe. And by any measure, American-European relations have reached a nadir over the past few years. No aspect of public life has remained immune to this tension fraught with recrimination, antipathy, even open hostility. Regardless of the issue involved, the texture of the discourse has been full of irritation and anger. I mean, you know that things are bad when accountants start hurling all kinds of insults across the Atlantic. I mean, intellectuals, sociology professors, whatever, poets, that's fine. But accountants, usually not sort of the most kind of riled people, but even there, you have a tremendous amount of anger over issues related to accounting, but of course it's over something much deeper. The German proverb, der Ton macht die Musik, or the tone makes the music, comes to mind. Indeed, this proverb's wisdom informs much of the study, since the saying clearly denotes the important fact that the form matters at least as much as substance, or better still, that form is in fact substance. Accordingly, the study is as much about the how as it is about the what. In particular, it will demonstrate, I hope, that a steady and growing resentment of the United States, indeed most things American, has permeated European discourse and opinion since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, very strong correlation there, and thus the end of the bipolar world of the Cold War that dominated Europe since 1945. However, it will also argue that the manifest nature of this antipathy hails from very long, fertile history. Anti-Americanism is a particularly murky concept because it invariably merges antipathy towards what America does, this is important, what America does, with what America is, or rather is projected to be in the eyes of its beholders. Thus, it has characteristics like any other prejudice in that its holders prejudges the object and its activities apart from what actually transpires in reality. And just like in the case of any prejudice, anti-Americanism too says much more about those that hold it than the object of its ire and contempt. But where anti-Americanism differs markedly from classical, in big quotation marks, prejudices such as anti-Semitism, homophobia, misogyny, racism, is the fact that unlike in these latter cases, where Jews, gays, and lesbians, women, and ethnic minorities rarely, if ever, have any actual power in and over the majority of populations in most countries in which they reside, the real existing United States most certainly does have power and plenty of it. And because of this unique paradox, the separation between what America is, i.e. its way of life, its symbols, its products, its people, and what America does, especially via its foreign policy or policy writ large, will forever be murky and impossible to disentangle. I would argue that it is precisely because of this fact that, unlike these other prejudices, which, as a fine testimony to progress and tolerance over the past 40 years, have by and large become publicly illegitimate in most advanced industrial democracies, anti-Americanism remains not only acceptable in many public circles, it has even become commendable, indeed a badge of honor, and perhaps one of the most distinct icons of being a progressive these days. After all, by being anti-American, one adheres to a prejudice that ipso facto also opposes a truly powerful force in the world, and sometimes a force that doesn't particularly perform admirably. Thus, in the case of anti-Americanism, one's prejudice partially assumes an antinomian purpose, thereby attaining a legitimacy in certain circles that other prejudices, thankfully, do not anymore, at least not in the accepted public discourse of advanced industrial democracies. Anti-Americanism, just like any other prejudice, is an acquired set of beliefs, an attitude and ideology, not an ascribed trait. Thus, it is completely independent of the national origins of its particular holder. Indeed, many Americans can be and are anti-American, just like Jews can be and are anti-Semitic. Non-Caucasians can and do hold racist views, and women misogynist ones. The reason I'm mentioning this is because often the very existence of anti-Americanism is denied by dint of Americans adhering to such positions. It is not a matter of the holder's citizenship or birthplace that ought to be the appropriate criteria, but rather her or his set of acquired beliefs about a particular collective. But here too, context means everything. Delighting in Michael Moore's Bowling for Columbine in an artsy movie theater in Ann Arbor, Madison, or Berkeley, or anywhere else, the way I did, is a completely different experience. It has a vastly different social meaning from having this film become the movie of choice about the United States among German youth, including right-wing and left-wing radicals in towns of the former East Germany, who use it as a bonding experience between and among them, or actually in Europe in general. I'm just actually supervising this the internet is amazing. I mean, so this young German student sought me out. He lives somewhere in a small town in Bavaria to help him write his sort of English graduating paper for his Abitur. And he's writing this on bowling for Columbine in this town. And what he shows actually is very interesting, that it's indeed people who are very kind of conventional CSU, it's a very conservative party, members who have otherwise no particularly antinomian position, who actually have rejoiced in this movie precisely because, of course, it says something that goes way deeper than the movie itself. Racist lyrics by rappers do not become less racist by virtue of their being articulated by African American artists, but their very quality changes completely were the same lyrics uttered by whites. Few people have a more deprecating sense of humor than Jews, yet it makes a whale of a difference whether the jokester is Jewish or not. The content defines, but the context lends meaning. As much as possible, this study is about the is and not the does. I will argue that in Europe, anti-Americanism has been much more about the essence of America, or put more precisely, the interpretation of how Europeans constructed this essence for their own purposes, than America's actual activities. This is clearly not the case with other manifestations of contemporary anti-Americanism. Thus, for example, as my colleague Professor Meredith Wu Cummings at the University of Michigan argues in a superb paper on changing public opinion in the Republic of Korea, the Korean antipathies towards the United States have none of the depth, the acerbity, the deeply negative characteristics and traditions that their European counterparts have, and remain clearly much more anchored in the dislike of America's actual activities, i.e. in its doing, than its character, its essence, its being. Unlike elsewhere in the world, at least until very recently, America represented a particularly loaded concept to Europeans, precisely because America was, of course, a European creation, which, however, more than any other former European extension, consciously defected from its European origins relatively early in the colonial game. Anti-Americanism in Europe has always been much more about, again, about America's being as opposed to the rest of the world's antipathy, where it is much more about its doing. To be sure, just like to the Europeans, this imagined America served all kinds of purposes, not least of which was to delineate a clear other to themselves. The exact obverse pertained to Americans as well, who throughout their history created all kinds of imagined Europes that fulfilled an othering function. This America as Europe's other, and vice versa, has best been characterized by my friend and colleague Bernd Ostendorf at the University of Munich, who calls it a compulsive folie à deux for over 3 centuries. However, I perceive an important difference in the respective agencies of this folie à deux on the 2 continents. Whereas in the United States, the carriers of prejudice and antipathy toward Europe have predominated, if at all, in the lower social strata, American elites, particularly cultural ones, have consistently extolled Europe and continue to do so. This love for and emulation of European tastes, mores, fashions, and habits remained a staple of American elite culture even during the country's most nativist and isolationist periods. It is safe to say that virtually all of America's highbrow culture continues to be European. One need only look at the humanities departments of any leading American universities to observe this continuing cultural hegemony, which even in, what's ironic to me, even in its persistent attempt to distance itself or negate Eurocentrism, of course, resorts to completely European concepts. The word European, I'm actually in the process of researching this in great detail empirically, conjures up through advertising agencies, there's lots of data on this, conjures up in the American mind always quality, class, something's, European facial, European this, European that, something positive. Any resentment of Europe by American mass opinion is of a completely different order of magnitude than anti-Americanism's presence in Europe. Freedom fries just simply had no traction. It was laughable. First of all, the parallel words to anti-Americanism, namely anti-Europism or anti-Europeanism, are virtually non-existent. Indeed, actually, my spell checker doesn't even have it. Second, Americans in their history have been known to be massively anti-French. We're actually going through a period now. Anti-German, massively, certainly after World War I and others. Anti-Russian, anti-British, anti-communist, but never anti-European. To be sure, one important aspect of acculturation to America was to oppose things from the old country, to try to distance oneself from the old world in an attempt to create a new one. In that sense, one would speak of a distancing from Europe, but this never attained the degree of aversion that anti-Americanism has for Europeans. And here, too, there are huge differences by social class and status. Ordinary Europeans, again in quotation marks, have never, at least until now, and I'll come to that, it's a big point of my lecture, exhibited the aversion towards America as have their elites. Indeed, as demonstrated by regular public opinion surveys since the 1950s, a solid majority of Europeans have expressed positive views of America, with only about 30% holding negative ones. Of course, the most important approval by European masses was that they came here. Tellingly, interestingly, the higher one proceeds on the social scale of the respondents, the greater the quantity of negative attitudes towards America becomes. As such, anti-Americanism, again, is an outlier, is arguably one of the very few prejudices in contemporary Europe which correlate positively with education and social status. The higher the education, the greater the prejudice. This was, for instance, the case, let's say, if you took anti-Semitism in Germany or Austria until certainly 1945, but even actually in the 50s. Basically, universities were the bastions. The more educated you were, the more anti-Semitic you were. What has happened, which is again one of the great reforms of the post-war world, of post-war liberal democracy, that this has in fact completely disappeared and become reversed. So typically, almost all right radical parties in Europe are not part of the intelligentsia as they were in the interwar period, but in fact of often déclassé, poorly educated white males, young white males. A sort of inverted mirror image has characterized this European American folie à deux with very different weights in their respective agencies. European masses have by and large liked and respected America, while European elites have certainly not, whereas American elites have liked and respected Europe, with American masses much less so. Now, perhaps what differentiates the current level and quality of European anti-Americanism from all its predecessors is the fact that for the very first time in history, a solid majority of European publics also bear negative attitudes towards the United States, thus establishing, again maybe for the first time, a complete congruity with their elites on this topic. And this actually is very much driven by the, alas, very, very troubling policies of the Bush administration, but not the origins of anti-Americanism at all. Lest there be any misunderstandings and conceptual uncertainties as to what exactly I mean by anti-Americanism, I'm using the definition offered by Paul Hollander in his major book on the subject, and let me quote, "Anti-Americanism is a predisposition to hostility towards the United States and American society, a relentless critical impulse toward American social, economic, and political institutions, traditions, and values. It entails an aversion to American culture in particular and its influence abroad, often also contempt for the American national character and dislike of American people, manners, behavior, dress, and a firm belief in the malignity of American influence and presence anywhere in the world." In other words, anti-Americanism clearly today has become a, French political scientist calls a major social vector in European public life. It is an ism, as I would call it. It's visible, palpable, audible, readable. And lest we get bogged down in definitions, Justice Potter Stewart's famous dictum about pornography, of course, pertains here as well. I know it when I see it. Let me now briefly do a historical overview here, because actually when I started with the research, I constantly started pushing backward. I thought to myself, oh, well, let's look at eras where this did not exist. So I thought, well, in the 50s, clearly the United States was an important protector of Western Europe and so on. It would not exist. Well, totally wrong. Then I look at the 20s and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that, in fact, there was no golden age. European elites viewed the United States with much resentment, well before America had any power. This is an important point, because it was often now argued that the United States is resented because of its power, which is correct. But clearly then you have to explain why it was resented when it was in fact a nothing. And well before, in fact, it was even an independent country. The tropes emerged among European elites very early on that exist to this day. Venality, vulgarity, mediocrity, and of course the most important of them all, inauthenticity. That there's something profoundly inauthentic about America itself and of course what it does. But what also was interesting from the get-go is a clear sense of danger in its undefinable but clearly evident attraction. From the beginning until today, European elites have continued to view America as this threatening parvenu. By the 18th century, Europeans start to depict America as degenerate, for instance, which is particularly odd since the country had barely been born. The French anthropologist Georges-Louis Leclerc, better known as Comte de Buffon, argued that in comparison with Africa, Asia, and even South America, North America's native population was particularly retarded and degenerate, and that this physiological and psychological inferiority somehow transferred onto the new European immigrants who, too, regressed once they reached America. According to de Buffon, this inevitable process of degeneration initiated by contact with America also affected the domestic animals that the Europeans brought with them. By the way, there's always this thing about animals. You'll see, it's fascinating. Just like their human masters, they regressed once making contact with the New World. Count de Buffon's degeneration thesis gained immense popularity and a wide audience among Europe's elites throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and was also seconded by other European interpreters of America, such as the Dutch naturalist Cornelius de Pauw, who decried the existence of America as, quote, the worst misfortune, unquote, that could have happened to all humanity, upsetting even the New World's dogs, who, according to de Pauw, never barked. This view of America as degenerate and as something profoundly inauthentic has remained a major staple of European elite opinion to this day. Herbert Spiro, an expert on the subject, of course, correctly says, quote, an anti-Americanism has been endemic among the ruling classes, or what the French call classe politique, in continental Europe since 1776 at the latest. No lesser observer of the United States than the great Alexis de Tocqueville, I'm sure many of you have read him, completely understood and in part reflected this European ressentiment. By the way, I'm actually using throughout the stuff the French ressentiment, which is more powerful than the English resentment, because I'm sort of using the Nietzschean and Max Scheler's work on ressentiment. Actually, is much deeper and it really has a lot about envy and hatred and stuff. Anyway, but we can go into that in the question period if you want. Already Tocqueville, this Europeanism towards America, which already by the early 19th century bespoke a clear fear on the part of the Europeans, which rested partly in America's potential as a powerful country, but also in its undeniable, almost irresistible attraction, especially to Europe's masses, certainly not the aristocracy's friend. When de Tocqueville predicted the rise of Russia, by the way, this is amazing, in the 1830s, and America as the two superpowers of the 20th century, mainly by dint of their continental expanse, he argued that one would be more attractive and successful than the other. The United States, according to Tocqueville, would become a hegemon by dint of its vibrancy, what he called in civil society, its pluralism, its diversity, of course, its religious freedom, whereas Russia would do so mainly by dint of autocracy. He, of course, also actually predicted in certain ways the fall of the USSR, as did, again, Karl Deutsch in an amazing article in the late 50s in which he called tremendously prescient, called the USSR, the Soviet Union, basically all mouths and no ears. In other words, that in fact the Soviet elites, the system actually never listened. From the get-go, there was something eerily attractive for Europeans about America, well beyond the new life that it offered to millions of Europe's masses. It was similar yet different, weak yet powerful, repellent yet attractive. In notable contrast to any other country, from the very beginning, the enemy for European elites was not America the conqueror, not the imperial republic, but what Joe Jaffe so beautifully calls America the beguiling. I think nowhere has this more consistent and powerful sentiment been better expressed than in the lyrics of Johnny Hallyday, that self-styled French Elvis Presley. Matthias mentioned to you that I work on sports, actually do a lot of sort of popular culture as well. And this guy, actually fascinating character, went to lots of his concerts. When he sings in this great song called Quelque chose de Tennessee, and it goes like this, I'll quote it in French and then I'll translate it. Cette force qui nous pousse vers l'infini, y a peu d'amour avec tellement d'envie. That force which pushes us towards infinity, there is so little love, but so much envie in French, desire, envy. The point here is that well before America had any power that could in any way rival that of major European powers such as Britain and France, well before it became, again, what Joe Jaffe calls Mr. Big, as it is now, European elites already resented it. Now, I will now give a couple of examples from some German thinkers, and the reason I'm doing this is I absolutely reject that there's such thing as German anti-Americanism. I told you it's European in all its tropes, and the reason I'm doing this is because I just had to select some, and I happen to be in a German department. My German is a hell of a lot better than my French or Italian, but all of this could be easily found in those cultures as well. From the 18th century on, you have, of course, the dichotomy between German Kultur versus America's Zivilisation, already beginning with Hegel, but others, virtually all German observers, condemn the political immaturity of the United States, mainly by virtue of its not having a European-style state. You hear this to this day. In other words, that American politics, by virtue of being different, is actually not just different, but in fact something retarded. Heine wrote of America that it was, quote, a colossal jail of freedom where the mob, the most disgusting tyrant of all, carries out its crude authority. He continued, you dear German farmers, go to America. There neither princes nor nobles exist. There all people are equal. They're all the same boors. Jakob Burckhardt equated the allegedly anti-historical nature of American society with barbarism. He discussed the wonderful article, actually, the ahistorical Bildungsmensch who exists in America's blandness, monotony, mediocrity, and uniformity, and thus whose only escape lay in an inevitable and pathetic. He's one of the few Europeans, actually, with me, who actually find this very problematic about this pathetic imitation of Europe's mores and values on the parts of American elites. Nikolaus Lenau, born in Csatár in Hungary, very near my birthplace in Timișoara. Actually, I went to a German elementary school in Timișoara, which was named the Nikolaus Lenau Schule, in Romanian Școala Medie numărul 2. A major America enthusiast, before his trip to the United States, was so disappointed in all things American after his arrival that he returned to Germany in a completely dejected state, informing his countrymen that they were serious and deep, quoting, serious and deep reasons that there were no nightingales and no singing birds at all in this awful country of worn-out people and scorched forests. Again, this absence of certain animals. To the Romantics, America's Bodenlosigkeit, or rootlessness, was an unforgivable sin. Simon Schama informs us that the flimsy frame construction of American houses was prima facie evidence for Germans of America's rootlessness. This association of America with rootlessness became, of course, a major staple of German views of America, well beyond the radical rights and the Nazis' blood and soul ideology. Thus, for example, in many a current discussion pertaining to the alleged advantages, and which there certainly are, of the so-called Rhenish as opposed to the American model of economic and social management, one often hears that in contrast to the ills of the American flexible labor markets, which exact high degree of geographic mobility by workers, Germans are much more tied to home and hearth. Friedrich Nietzsche, whom I mentioned already, hated America as the epitome of the modern, which he foresaw as the inevitable conqueror of Europe as well. He kind of foresaw this, basically, the kind of Americanization of the world. Long in advance of Hollywood movies, rock or rap music, the spread of American culture was likened to a form of disease. Its progress in Europe seemed inevitable, worse yet irresistible. Quote Nietzsche, the faith of the American is becoming the faith of the European as well. And Nietzsche's student, Arthur Möller van den Broek, best known for having popularized the phrase the Third Reich, proposed the concept of Amerikanertum, Americanness, which was not to be defined geographically, but spiritually, conceptually. Sigmund Freud, great story, viewed the United States as embodying the most pronounced manifestation of everything that he found despicable in modern civilization. To Freud, America represented something inferior, primitive, materialistic, and brutish, yet at the same time also something immensely seductive, alluring, and irresistible, thus providing fertile ground for ressentiment, of course. Interesting, of course, Freud didn't mind that civilization, its discontents, which was not a big seller in Europe, became, of course, a huge success in the United States, netting Freud and handsome pretty penny. And Heidegger, of course, frequently mentioned Americanism as soulless, greedy, inauthentic, and so on. Unique among Europeans was the Germans' inordinate extolling of Native Americans as the noble savages, whom the Germans regarded as their true soulmates in the defense of authentic culture against the onslaught of America's materialist and venal civilization. Nowhere does this theme, this primitivism, become more visible than in the very influential writings of Karl May, whose pulp fiction became a staple of every middle-class child's, particularly boys, me included, reading throughout the 20th century. I have a student in the German department at Michigan who's writing a dissertation on this. Lastly, of course, as I said, not only German elites and intellectuals of the 19th century expressed a habitual disdain for America. I would like to mention Charles Dickens, Francis Trollope, Evelyn Waugh, Knut Hamsun, Joseph de Maistre, Stendhal, just to mention a few. Indeed, it is quite clear that there only exists a European anti-Americanism as opposed to a German, etc., etc. Günther Bischoff, colleague of mine at the University of New Orleans, gives us an ample evidence that this ressentiment has been alive and well in Austria as well throughout the 20th century, just like elsewhere in contemporary Europe, and might indeed be happily proliferating in the current atmosphere of its perhaps unprecedented social acceptability. He writes, Austrian anti-Americanism today is hardly unique. Let me now briefly talk about how about anti-Semitism, and again in the context of why this is important in the discussion of sort of anti-Americanism and its link to, above all, via modernity. While an attempt at a meaningful discussion of anti-Semitism in the present framework would be nothing short of intellectually arrogant, the topic needs at least a peripheral mention, since in the course of the 20th century it has become one of anti-Americanism's most consistent conceptual comparisons and companions, perhaps even one of its very features. To be sure, European anti-Semitism preceded anti-Americanism by centuries, indeed by millennia. And the two did not emerge as the inseparable tandem that they have now become until the late 19th century. However, far and away the most important difference between the two is, and this is of course by far the most important difference, is the fact that European anti-Semitism killed millions of innocent people, whereas even in its most virulent form, European anti-Americanism rarely, if ever, went beyond the prolific burning of American flags and or the destruction of American institutes or buildings and property. And that's, of course, a major difference. Already in the 17th century, well before the establishment of the American Republic, the divergent paths that religion took in these two settings, and that still differentiate the United States from Europe perhaps more than any other single social, political, cultural factor, also had a major bearing on the development of anti-Semitism in these two respective societies. By the way, if you look at Ron Engelhardt, my dear colleague at Michigan's data and his World Value Survey, what makes the United States a real outlier in its comparative context to other liberal democracies is that it in fact is far and away the most religious country. By any measure, do you believe in God, do you go to church, whatever. It's a completely, here Europe, especially Western Europe, and not only Western Europe, you see already a precipitous de-religionation, if that's a word, of such formerly profoundly religious countries as Ireland and the two left that were still left, Ireland and Poland. So this is actually a very interesting phenomenon, how religion is actually constructed differently and remains to be constructed differently, which I think also has actually a bearing on my topic, but this was kind of a digression. Whereas Europe's religious life continued to be ruled, this is an important linkage between state and church, by a deeply anti-Semitic Catholic Church in the continent's geographic center and its south, a state-oriented, equally anti-Semitic Protestantism, mainly of the Lutheran variety in its north, though one would need to differentiate, I don't have time to do that here, between the vehemence of anti-Semitism practiced by German Lutheranism as opposed to its much milder Danish and Swedish variants, and a structurally very similar orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy in Europe's eastern regions. America's religious life featured two characteristics that Europe never had, and the ramifications of which Europeans fail to comprehend to this day, and which in fact also constructed anti-Semitism differently. First, religion in America was completely decentralized and local, and it still is. I always tell my European friends I could actually start the United Church of Markowitz tomorrow. Not sure many people would join, but you can. Just like it's start the... My father, may he rest in peace, never understood that there was no chief rabbi in America. Who is the chief rabbi? No chief rabbi. Different state construction. The search for political freedom in America was, as de Tocqueville well understood, inextricably tied to the search for religious freedom, organized religion, thus giving religion and religious vocabulary in American politics a completely different meaning that both have had in Europe. Okay? Second, it featured a Protestantism that professed its great admiration for the Jews, that indeed saw itself as close relatives to the Jews, whose ancient writings and customs it extolled. This, after all, was the world in which biblical names such as Elijah, Jedediah, Jeremiah, Josiah, these guys with beards, whatever, became commonplace. The point is that from the founding of the American Republic, the framework wherein people related to Jews and Judaism were profoundly different in America from what they had been in Europe. By the way, this is, of course, an interesting argument. For instance, if you look at some of the German right-wing literature, and of course also the Nazi literature over Britain, and the linkage, of course, of Protestantism, especially about Cromwellian Protestantism, and its extolling or kind of linkage of the Old Testament and the Jews, the chosen people, you have, of course, the argument by various theorists that basically kind of equate the two or create kind of a sort of Judaized England or so on. Zombart actually, in his later work on comparing sort of creative versus rapacious capitalism. Still, it was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that anti-Semitism began to accompany European anti-Americanism in a systematic and regular manner. It was the fear and critique of capitalist modernity that brought these two ressentiments together. America and the Jews were seen as paragons of modernity, money-driven, profit-hungry, urban, universalistic, individualistic, mobile, ruthless, hostile to traditions and values. By the way, a brilliant new book that I could recommend by Avishai Margalit and Ian Buruma just published, Occidentalism, in which they talk about the importance, actually, to all this, in this criticism of the city, of the kind of the animosity towards urban life, of the quintessential aspect of the urban life as modernity. That it was the fear of modernity linking Jews and Americans at this juncture of European ressentiment is best borne out by the fact that Jewish immigration to the United States had not yet reached the large numbers that it would 20 years later. In other words, it was not the actually existing United States and its Jews that were feared and disdained, but the combination of Judaism and Americanism as concept and social trends. After World War I, the Jews as rulers of America became pronounced. It was at this juncture that the notion of Jewish Wall Street, Jewish Hollywood, Jewish jazz, in other words, of a thoroughly Jewified America became commonplace. It was also at this time that all the forerunners for current codes, such as the East Coast. I always actually annoy people in Europe. I say, what are you talking about? Why just the East Coast? What about us Midwestern Jews? We're also devious. We're permanently established. From then on, Jews in America became inextricably intertwined, not only as representatives of modernity, but holders of actual power. Okay? Things appeared to have, and this is important, of course, at the height of this obviously was National Socialism. Now, things appeared to have changed after the end of World War II, the Holocaust, the establishment of Israel, and the Cold War. It's an important caesura. American power, though still massively resented, became a much-needed protector against the Soviet Union, its allies, and communism. Probably for the first time in over 900 years, the Holocaust rendered overt anti-Semitism socially unacceptable among Europe's elites. And again, as I mentioned in the earlier part of the lecture, in general, one of the great achievements of all liberal democracies in the post-war period is that what we created basically a language of inclusion. It's really not acceptable to be offensive, at least to some degree. I think it's still way too much, but it really has decreased massively. And Jews, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, actually attained real power by dint, of course, of running a state. While these structural changes substantially altered the tone, the content of the discourse about Jews and America and Europe, the two remained as intertwined as ever. By the late 1960s, Israel became little more than an extension of American power to many, especially on Europe's left. Israel, and this is important, was disliked especially by the left, not because it was Jewish, it was very much against anti-Semitism, but because it was American. And as such, it was powerful. It is by virtue of this shifting power that contemporary Europeans dislike Israel so intensely, and why their current anti-Semitism assumes a different veneer from the traditional one that dominated Europe for 1,000 years. As Mark Lila from the University of Chicago has so eloquently argued, contemporary Europe's allegedly post-national elites dislike states that behave the way European states used to before 1945, which means assertively, unilaterally, particularistically, realpolitically, all of which, of course, Israel does, and the United States, of course, as well, especially under the Bush administration. The fact that current European anti-Semitism has changed is best demonstrated by the fact that very few people who are ostensibly appalled by anti-Semitic incidents in their own countries are also often Israel's most ruthless critics. That they then often resort to characterizations of Israel's essence and its very existence, and again I'll go into this, as opposed to its policies. Essence and existence as opposed to policies, which is perfectly acceptable, in eerily similar terms and tone to the old-fashioned European anti-Semitism of yore, attests not to the end of European anti-Semitism, but merely its mutation from what Daniel Goldhagen calls so aptly the Shylock Jew, which is of course unacceptable in today's European discourse, to the Rambo Jew, a highly legitimate perception. Of course, we all know how much Rambo is adored in Europe. Now let me give a couple of reasons why, give the framework of why this anti-Semitism, how it sort of is contextualized, and why Jews have become a contested space. Number one, the disappearance of communism as an enemy and a perceived threat, and thus the need to accord absolute primacy to the task of containing, even defeating this perceived ill. This is of course gone. Second, indeed, with the disappearance of communism and the major task at hand to begin coming to terms with that past, namely of course the Stalinist past, anti-Semitism has made its periodic appearance in a number of East European countries where the old adage, Jew equals Bolshevik, has been revived. But I'm not sure whether you've heard, the Hungarian Writers Association just dissolved a week ago over this huge issue again about anti-Semitism and linked to the role of Jews in being overrepresented in the sort of repressive dimensions of the Hungarian Stalinist regime, a major issue.